Hi, I'm Daniel Noah. I'm the director of SpectreVision Radio, which is a podcast network that is entirely devoted to esoteric studies. We cover everything from UAP disclosure to ghosts and consciousness and metaphysics and psychedelics and folklore and mythology, and anything immaterial is fair game for us. Today they were kind enough to give us this stage all day. So we have four panels, four live podcasts that together kind of tell a story. Today we begin with a session we're calling Reality Bytes, There Is No Spoon, which is kind of an examination of reality itself, or rather questioning what reality is or what it isn't. And so we have three podcasters here today who are all in various ways specialize in this topic, and we'll bring them out. Rizwan Virk, who is the author of The Simulation Hypothesis. Darren King, who also is known by the handle Exoacademian, which is the name of his podcast. And Jordan Crowder, Conscious Observers is his show, which is also on the network. Thanks, guys. So I think it'd be good to start by, let's start with sort of your Clark Kents. Before we get into the weird, let's start with the familiar. Before you found yourself in this space, who were you? What was your life? What were you doing? We can just go down the line.
Sure. So my background is in computer science, which I studied at MIT many years ago. And then rather than entering the business, entering a large corporation, I ended up starting my first startup at the age of 23 and pretty much spent a lot of my career in the startup world, initially in enterprise software. So during the day, I was dealing with engineers, investors, Fortune 1000 customers. Then I moved out to Silicon Valley for business school on the other coast at Stanford. And then somehow I found myself in the video game industry. And so at one point we built the #1 game in the App Store many years ago now, back when the App Store was relatively small.
What was that called?
It was called Tapfish. And
Tapfish?
Tapfish, yeah.
Tapfish, okay.
It was a resource management or simulation game where you were managing a tank full of fish, and then you would show it to your friends. And it was kind of fun because after having been in the enterprise software world, we were at a pizza place in Silicon Valley, and we looked over and there were a bunch of high school kids playing our game.
Cool.
And so that was a lot of fun. But I was living a double life during those days, where in the evenings and the weekends, I would go off to places like the Monroe Institute, which I know Jordan is involved with, doing lucid dreaming and shamanic journeying and stuff. So I was also kind of living this double life for many years.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Darren, how about you? What's your secret identity?
Well, I would say it comes from like a broad experience in different fields that have unusually and uncannily kind of come together in what I do now in ways that I never would have predicted when I was going through those. And one of the interesting things is how living life tends to recontextualize, your history, and you look back and you realize, well, this piece was really important. This piece was important, even though it felt meandering at the time, because it was a combination of sort of consciousness studies, and I was really involved with integral theory, kind of Wilberian understanding of how we can take different domains of understanding, everything from science to non-dual teaching, and see these as complementary ways of making sense of reality. So I was doing that, and then kind of got more into software engineering, which, as Riz knows, becomes really interesting because when you start studying the nature of reality itself, and you get down to the nitty-gritty of that, you notice some uncanny parallels as a software engineer. And so while those might seem like completely, disparate kind of fields, they've actually really co-informed my understanding of reality. And then since then, been really wrapped up in what is the nature of reality and how are all these different aspects somehow playing a role in it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Jordan, how about you?
Mine's a little on the more traumatic side, unfortunately. So, I was a normal person, very materialist-minded. This is a physical matter reality. We live, we die, it's over, that's it. And then I had a near-death experience in 2019.
Wait, hold on. Before we get to that,
yeah.
Before the near-death experience, what were you doing with yourself?
I was a designer. I made websites. I was a web developer. I was in marketing. I was a pretty normal dude. Beautiful wife, 2 beautiful daughters. my mom passed away unexpectedly, and it really changed my life and made me look at everything completely differently. We were in Dallas doing the corporate thing at the time, and we threw caution to the wind. We moved to the beach in Florida, didn't know anybody, got a house sight unseen, barely any money, no connections, no anything, and completely restarted our life, I think I was 35 at the time. And, that was a big deal for me because it was shifting from kind of my part one of Jordan to part two. And then, unfortunately, it didn't go as planned, and that's what led to my kind of downward spiral, which turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. But I didn't know it at the time.
Let's just go right into it, and then we'll go backwards down the line. So then tell us about your transition.
So for me, I struggled with addiction and alcoholism for a very long time, and I had just got to this rock bottom point where my body was basically shutting down on me and dying. I felt like I had sanitized my consciousness out of my vessel towards the end there, kind of like leaving a car on the side of the road with the keys in it and it running, and opportunistic things were kind of taking advantage of the situation. So I was struggling and fighting all sorts of things along the way. And I get to this rock bottom point, near death, out of body experience, the whole shebang. And at that point, I go from a materialist minded person who thinks that, basically the logical way, your brain creates the illusion of consciousness, we aren't more than our physical body. And then all of a sudden, I'm thrust, instantly into this world of knowing that I'm more than my physical body, because at a certain point, I'm outside of my body, watching it die on the bed below me. And you have to compute all this. Okay, I'm up here, I'm retaining my memory, my sense of self, my personality, I have awareness, I have consciousness, my body's down there, what's going on here? And then that's really what kind of blew the door open. I didn't have time to really delve too much into it at that point, because I'm literally dying, but that stuck with me. And as I healed and went on my recovery journey, I had a Kundalini awakening experience, and basically from that point on, nothing's ever been the same. I got this booming voice telling me these three questions. They were, who are you, where are you, why are you? And those three questions hit me like a freight train, never left my brain since, and every day I pursue those three questions. Who are we, where are we, and why are we here? And that's what I do all day, every day.
So do you feel like, so these two guys described both of them were sort of living a dualistic life between something somewhat traditional and materialist. You were both in software, or some version of software, but you had a foot in the other world. You didn't initially, and you only had one foot in the what are we calling it? The terrestrial reality. And it sounds like what you're explaining is that maybe the lack of that spirituality, or whatever we're calling it, led you to being very imbalanced, and that led to alcoholism. So you said, how did you describe it? Missed opportunities? Is that what you said?
Well, I think I said opportunistic entities
opportunistic entities.
Yeah, different intelligences and consciousnesses that are looking for physical avatars to inhabit and joyride. But for me, like, the imbalance was a big part. Like, I felt most of my life I was not in tune, not in balance. My higher self was trying to force itself through me to get me in balance, to get me connected. And like, there's a quote I love: if you don't listen to your body when it whispers, so you don't have to hear it scream. Mm-hmm. Basically, I didn't listen to all the nudges and whispers. It eventually screamed. It forced this Kundalini awakening through, which reasserted my higher self, my consciousness, back on top, gave it back control of the steering wheel. But then I had to put together all the pieces, like, what the heck just happened? What is this place? What's going on here? And that's what led me down this path.
And can you explain what you mean by a Kundalini experience?
I kind of, to break it down simply, it's kind of like, imagine a jack-in-the-box. So I describe ourselves as a combination of two things, a higher self and a human self. Higher self being the consciousness. I describe this whole place as a simulator for consciousness development. The consciousness comes in here to experience physical life, through the adversities and challenges and everything. You grow at a consciousness level. So this is kind of like an avatar here, and it's like a character in a game, and our consciousness is using it. Well, the consciousness is supposed to have this, a certain amount of control. And what we do is we push it down like a jack-in-the-box. We suppress it, and we don't listen to it. And the ego reasserts itself. The physical body asserts itself, and the consciousness gets suppressed. Well, the consciousness comes here for a reason. It has missions, to-do lists, things it needs to accomplish while it's here. So at a certain point, it has to reassert its control. And it tries to do that gently and subtly through nudges, synchronicities, messages. If we don't listen, at a certain point, it just has to do what it has to do. And that's what this Kundalini awakening for me was very forceful and spontaneous, which is not the best way to do it. But I felt like through that, it's like a jack in the box, just ripping through you. And it's basically flipping on all the switches along the way. You go from a dark house, no lights on, to all your lights on, you're buzzing. There's a thin line between psychosis and enlightenment. So when that happens, it's tricky, and you have to walk the tightrope. And I wiggled back and forth between those two states quite often. And now I feel like I got it put together. But it was a tricky ride, but yeah, that Kundalini is just like it's a jack in the box ripping through you. Yeah.
Thank you. Darren, how about you? What was your initiation?
I'd say there's two that I would point to. The first one I point to, and also what's interesting about this is that depending on how familiar people are with these kinds of topics, they might seem like completely different topics, but inevitably, as we were all talking about it, they tend to bleed together. My first experience of sort of recognizing that the way we have framed reality cannot possibly be complete was a very personal experience. It was 20 years ago. I was moving my young family across the country from Tennessee to Washington State, and we were staying in a hotel, and in the early mornings of the staying in the hotel, I woke up to find a female entity at the end of our bed. And as I got out of bed to move towards this entity, it proceeded to back up and went right through the wall. And now, I was lucky in the sense that my wife happened to see the whole thing too. I think many people who have these experiences really question them afterwards. You question your sanity, but when you have two of you, it makes a big difference. And then what she told me is, well, first of all, the thing that was really strange was, and it made no sense at the time, but when you study the lore later on, even within the UFO phenomenon, it seems again like a disparate topic altogether, but very often humanoid figures or even human-looking figures are encountered. And secondly, often you make strange behavioral choices. Yeah. So I just had to come back to bed and go to sleep as if nothing had happened, as if people go through walls every second Tuesday kind of thing. And as I came back to bed, my wife saw the being come back through the wall and then proceed to go down the hall and through the front door of the hotel. I was almost going to fall asleep, and she kind of shook me on my stupor and said, "What are you doing going to sleep after that?" That kind of shocked me out of that kind of trance state. We talked about it. We decided to skip the continental breakfast and hit the road. That was the first experience, right? That was completely jarring. I remember emailing people, you had the one computer in the front lobby of the hotel at that time. Yeah. And people were like, "That's weird, but how's the weather, in that part of the country," right? They just didn't know what to do with it. So I just could have put it in the back burner because I had no place to put it. There was no logical way to make sense of that. Then later on, I got into understanding how these different paranormal topics bleed into the UFO phenomenon and inevitably get to this question of the nature of reality. So I then went full force, kind of like what Jordan was saying, full-time exploring this. And again, you also begin to have this really, speaking of the mission, this uncanny feeling that you are remembering that you were going to do this. It's a very strange flipping upside down the way you think about physical reality. So then, in my case, I actually developed a protocol I could use. It's a pretty extreme protocol. I don't tend to tell people all the details because it can be dangerous physically and psychologically if you're not prepared. But it basically drops you out of the construct altogether. It's really extreme. And in that experience, I had many of those same experiences of, you have this feeling of unitive awareness where you suddenly don't lose the sense of I amness, but what you are becomes so much more expansive. And to some degree, you are the events of the environment just flowing. There is no doer and the doing. There is just the awareness of the doing. It's a completely unitive experience. So when I came back in, what was shocking was two things. The first one was this is not real like we think it is, speaking of the nature of reality. But just as importantly was the way that I knew that, because it wasn't cerebral kind of knowing. It wasn't conceptual at all. It was a kind of knowing I had never in this lifetime experienced before. It was like a structural awareness, seeing this construct from outside it. When you come back in, it's almost like you're in a computer program that's booting back up, right? And you become aware of it in a way you never have before. And then fantastically and really discombobulatingly, I began to, even in the days and weeks and months to follow, would have memories bleed through from that expanded sense of myself that I had they're not from this lifetime. And they would just be triggered by seeing a reed growing out of a pond and remembering that looks like this other reality-scape I remember experiencing and visiting. So those were the two events that really unmoored me and sent me in a new direction.
What did the entity look like?
Well, mostly human. The facial features were slightly more angular than that. This is another aspect that's really fascinating because this, again, is part of the lore, if you study it closely, is that not only are they often humanoid figures, often human even, but what people experience varies, right? So Jacques Vallée covered one case where 3 people in a car saw something, but they each saw something different. The thing they caught on film looked like none of any of the things they saw, and apparently nobody else in this busy traffic saw anything at all, right? So it really calls into question the nature of reality. But I bring that up because in this case, my wife saw the entity from like the torso up, and she saw blonde hair blowing as if in wind. There was no wind in the room. I just saw straight blonde hair like on the sides of the head. So subtle differences in what we saw, but we both saw the same being.
I just want to drill in on the details. I think they're really interesting. Was she wearing the same thing to both of you?
Yeah, so that's the other thing, is that part was fairly obscured to me, actually. It's like as if my attention was focused on her head. I just remember, just kind of like a vague, indistinct kind of form down.
What about for your wife?
So she same sort of thing in terms of what she saw.
Yeah.
But again, she just saw from there was no legs at all, whereas I did see legs.
But she didn't sort of have a memory of the clothes.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Was a woman with long blonde hair? Was there some context to that for the two of you? Did you know someone like that, or?
No. None. And I would say that she looked like a late adolescent, and no context. As we were on the road, we called the front desk and said, "You guys have issues with apparitions in your hotel, or is this a common thing?" And they're like,
Click.
"No, but no, I don't think I want to go in that room." Right? And the other thing that happened too that was, again, might be related, might not be, is that when we woke up our 3-year-old daughter that was sleeping in the bed next to us, she had welts all over her body.
Oh, wow.
Now, that could have been an allergic reaction to a sheet or something, but she'd never had that before or since. And within about an hour of getting on the road, it completely cleared up and disappeared.
How old is she now?
My daughter?
Yeah.
She's 22.
Is she blonde?
Yes, she is. Well, that's interesting. Yes, it is. But I would say that the facial features didn't really match up.
Okay.
The other thing that is a really important piece to add too, in light of this bleed through into these different topics, is that my wife was pregnant with our son at the time as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I did sort of have this sense that two things. First of all, when I got up and walked towards her, the facial expression I registered was surprise. Was it surprise that I was awake? Surprise that I could see her?
Yeah.
Both.
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of, you had the sense like you woke up at the end of something, right?
Oh.
But other than that, I don't have any other context.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
How about you, Riz?
Well, as I mentioned, I was living this double life where I was an entrepreneur during the day and I was exploring consciousness at night. And what would happen is in my daily routine, whether it was when I was running a company or then later I became a venture capital investor, I would start to have these random precognitive dreams. Like I would have a dream about a particular competitor or business partner who I hadn't thought of in months or years, and then that day something would crop up that would validate that for me. And so I started to wonder about the nature of reality, but for the most part, these two worlds were kept separate. And then it was after I had sold my last video game company that I was visiting a startup that was doing a virtual reality set of games, and they were doing a ping pong game, and this was in Marin County, which is right across from San Francisco, and we had a beautiful view of the bay, and they were like, okay, forget about the view, here, try this on. So I put on this headset and I started to play this VR ping pong game. And what happened was that, the graphics were pretty bad, so this was in 2016, so it was like 10 years ago now, but the responsiveness was so good that for a moment it fooled my body into thinking that I was playing a real game of ping pong. So much so that at the end of the game I tried to put the paddle on the table and I tried to lean against the table, and of course there was no table. It was just in a room with a big helmet and wires from the ceiling. And so the controller fell to the floor, I almost fell over, and then I began to wonder, well, how long would it take us to build something that was so immersive that we would forget we were inside a virtual reality? Mm-hmm. So basically, how long would it take us to build the Matrix, really? And I call that the simulation point, which is a kind of technological singularity. Like when we hear the term singularity, we think super intelligent AI, Skynet's going to take over the world. But really, the term was borrowed from mathematics and physics and applied to technology to mean a time when technology is growing so exponentially that nothing will ever be the same for humans. And so I mapped out these stages of technology, and I realized, eventually we will be able to build these VR experiences that were indistinguishable from physical reality, and that they'll be populated with AI characters that we will be unable to distinguish whether those are avatars of real humans or they're just AI characters within the game. So I ended up then going back to all the consciousness experiences that I'd had, and I looked at what all the religious scriptures, like in the Bible and the Quran and the Vedas, particularly the mystical side of those traditions, and I realized that they were all telling us the same thing, that the physical world was not real, and that we're only here for a temporary period of time. And then I started to look into the quantum physics side of it, and I realized that, they're telling us the same thing, which is that there is no physical world, right? I mean, if you look at something like this microphone, it's 99.9% empty space, and if you keep opening it up, down to the atoms, it's also 99.9% empty space. And you go in the nucleus and you keep going. And, one of my favorite physicists from the 20th century was a guy named John Wheeler, and he worked with Einstein at Princeton. And he said, when you go all the way down, we're used to thinking of a particle as a hard object. And it turns out there aren't any, it's just information. And so the universe really consists of pixels. So I kind of wrapped all that together and realized that this model of the world being a simulation, and there's two types, we can talk about those later, NPC versus RPG, but being like a matrix was a way to bring together the different threads of my life, which included my being in the video game industry and the consciousness exploration. So I wrote my book, the first edition in 2019, called The Simulation Hypothesis, and I released it on March 31st, which was the 20th year anniversary of the Matrix. Wow. And literally on that day, and then at that point I was projecting where AI would go, and then last year Penguin Random House asked me to write a second edition for the 25th anniversary of The Matrix, because now AI had caught up to some of the predictions that I was making. Yeah. So that's kind of how I got into all this.
Will there be an edition for the anniversary of Matrix Revolutions? Sorry, terrible.
Probably not.
Yeah. The way that I always try and walk people into this idea, because it's a very hard idea to wrap your head around, is that let's use the microphone as an example. Okay, so as you look at this microphone and you hear my voice, this is data that's entering your brain through two of the five senses, right? And so you are in fact modeling this microphone and my voice in your brain. Everyone here is modeling everything that's happening in their brain. And when you think of it that way, it's easy to grasp the idea that we actually don't know what's really outside of our brains. We have no idea, actually. It could be that none of this is here, right? Or maybe it is. Maybe it's a one-to-one representation with a model that we make in our brain, or maybe it's a 50% what's happening or 0% what's happening. The other, I think, very digestible way to talk about this is that, so if you consider that the model is the sum of the data that's entering the five senses that we have, well, what about other senses? For example, birds migrate because they're able to read or perceive the electromagnetic spectrum. So what's that like? We don't know. We don't have that sense. It doesn't look like anything, sound like anything, smell like anything, taste like anything, or feel like anything. It's some other experience that's completely alien to us. How many other types of experiences are there that we don't possess? And this is why I've come to object to the term the sixth sense, because it suggests there's only one more, right? There's probably an infinite number of other senses or sensory experiences that we don't possess. And so if you can imagine for a minute, what would happen if you could suddenly access all of them? What would reality be like for us? And I think it would probably seem like utter chaos, because we're very primitive beings ultimately, although I'm sure it isn't. There is some incredible organizational principle behind all of it. And so I guess that's a good way into the next topic, or the next layer of this, which you've already alluded to, Darren, which is can you leave and by the way, we call it a simulation. You call it a simulator, Darren.
I would call it a construct.
A construct? Yeah. I was going to say, I don't know that, is there a term that we can all agree on that captures everyone's view on this? I think
I would just want to make this point, because there's a couple different ways, and Riz talked a bit about it, that you can think about this, right? The term simulation, right, usually means it's a copy, a rendering, right, yes, a facsimile of something else, right?
Right.
I look at it less like that, actually. I look at it more like, but it's still a construct. But the way I look at it is that there's unit of awareness, pure awareness, right, that is prior to manifestation. And any kind of reality, whether it's the reality of a bird, using larger components of the electromagnetic spectrum, or some other entity having some other kind of experience, all of those are actually like virtual realities in a way. But not necessarily because it's based on some computer mainframe of some alien physical civilization.
This is a really important point.
Yeah, right. So for me, I definitely lean towards idealism in terms of a model of reality that comports with what my experience was as well. And on top of that, again, speaking of the fact that you have this first-person expansive understanding of yourself outside the construct, you start realizing that, and this speaks to your point, right? Because to take any experience is the point. To add, you could argue, and again, this goes back to non-dual teaching and the way this has been understood through different traditions historically, that there's the one original mind, which then takes on the perspective of a certain vantage point to have novel experience. Yeah. It takes limitation to have differentiation and experience.
And that's what we're talking about here, that we have, our ability to perceive has been extremely limited. Well, and I'm suggesting by whom. We'll get to that. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, Riz. Well, I would add that you can think of it as an access. And so when I talk about simulation theory, I say it's the idea that the physical world is not physical, but it's based off of information. And that information gets rendered for us, like in a video game. So if you've ever played Fortnite or World of Warcraft, you're seeing your character, like an avatar, going through a landscape. You may see orcs in a castle. Those don't really exist, right? That's just data that is getting to your computer, and your computer is rendering that to make it seem as if there is a coherent scene.
In your analogy, what's the computer?
Well, so this is what I was going to say. Yeah. So there's an axis, and on one end of the axis, you can take it literally and say that we are living inside a information processing program. And at the other end of the axis, you can take it metaphorically. And so if you look at the religious scriptures, going back to Buddhism, they always try to define the world as an illusion or Maya or a dreamscape, for example. And you can see that the scriptures are full of technological metaphors. There's gates like the pearly gates of heaven. There's chariots. There's the wheel of reincarnation. There's the book of life. There's the scroll of deeds. These are all technology that is being used to describe something that may be ineffable. And so what I like to say is that as technology advances, we can use more advanced metaphors. Now, there was a guy named Swami Yogananda. He came over from India 100 years ago. He wrote a book called Autobiography of a Yogi, which was Steve Jobs' favorite book. And, the Beatles, they used to hand it out to people. And he came in 1920, and he basically used a new metaphor. He said the world is like a film projector. And he said we are like the actors. The characters are suffering and they die, but the actors don't. And he would use that to encourage the students to look away from the screen, to look at the beam of light that is projecting the shadows on the wall. And so if he were alive today, I think he'd say it's like a movie. We're the actors, but we're also sitting in the audience watching it. And we have scripts, so we're all supposed to play these roles to each other, but we can change the scripts. We can be interactive. And so what does that remind you of? So today I would say that reminds me of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game where you inhabit these characters for a while. And so you can look at it, in different ways. And so like when, as a scholar of this topic, I taught the first class at a university in the US about the simulation hypothesis, and it was called Science Fiction, Religion, Philosophy, and Technology, because there are so many different aspects of it. So I look at different ways of thinking about it. But I think the video game analogy is one that does tend to connect with people because they can understand that.
Sure, it's a familiar idea. But I want to get back to the question of where the rendering is taking place. So when you and I were looking for the green room earlier, and we turned left at the corner over here, and when that hallway was rendered, was it by us or by a third party?
Well, so this is what's interesting and why I really got deep into the quantum physics side of it, because in quantum physics there's something called the observer effect. And basically what happens is that particles stay in a state of superposition. So, the particle goes through the left or the right slit, or it can go through both, and that's called superposition. Or the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. And I looked at this and I thought, oh, wow, that reminds me of how we build video games. We actually render only that part of the world that our character can see at that point in time. And so, like, there was a game, actually in 2016, the same year that I was playing ping pong, a game called No Man's Sky. And they had 18 quintillion planets. Now, I was in the video game industry. There's no way we could build 18 quintillion planets. So what they did was they had AI and procedures and code that would generate the planets for you on the fly. And it seemed to me that quantum physics is basically implying that we are rendering the world as required. Now, when you play a video game and your character and mine are sitting on the stage, or we're not really sitting on the same stage, because I'm rendering it on my computer and you're rendering it on your computer. And in fact, and I think this touches on what Darren was talking about earlier, you may see something slightly different. You might say, look at the dragon, because you're level 30 and I'm level 2, and I'm like, there's no dragon in this field. But that's because my computer is not rendering it. And that's a technique we use in the video game industry, is we send it out. Now, the computer of our universe would have to be much more complicated. If you think of the Matrix, where was the Matrix rendered? In the brains of the people. They used what's called a brain-computer interface. And the actual rendering of that world was taking place in a distributed way.
So what you still haven't answered.
No, what I'm saying is each of us is rendering it.
So each of us is rendering it. But in a multiplayer
quote,
game...
unquote computer. And then there's a server that's keeping track of the data. So the rendering happens on the client side.
Okay, got it.
You see that?
Yep.
The server just keeps track of, okay, these 4 guys are on the stage in Austin, okay?
But
our character is looking at it through a first-person point of view.
Yes.
But some people have the ability to loosen that first-person point of view. They can go up and look down at what we're doing, or they can go look somewhere else.
Well, we're going to get there. Yeah, go ahead, Darren.
So a couple thoughts to sort of build on that, because I would even say, I would go a step further and say that, yes, certainly with quantum physics, we're certainly understanding, we're seeing this convergence between ancient non-dual teaching about the ultimate nature of reality that's 5,000 years old.
Explain what you mean by non-dual teaching.
So non-dual teaching basically speaks to the fact that ultimately the formless and the form are not two things. Right? Everything is arising out of a unit of experience that I talked about. And the reason why that's important is that I think at a certain, even still relative layer, Riz is collapsing the construct in a certain way. You are, I am. But then even the notion of each of us is also part of that differentiation rendering, right? Because when you look at, again, I think what you have to do is you have to try to take in all kind of fields of data to really understand what's going on here. And what's fascinating is when you look at people, for instance, who have near-death experiences, right? Often they will have this encounter where they will not only have a past life review, but they'll be able to experience all the events from everyone's perspective. Yep. They see how you made someone else feel with the words you said. You feel the entire thing simultaneously, right?
This is a commonly reported experience.
In terms of what's rendering what, at the most base level, foundationally, it's one unit of consciousness expressing in the myriad forms.
So let's talk about then. So if we're rendering, then it would stand to reason that the next logical step in this thought experiment, although it's perhaps not a thought experiment, is that can you manipulate the render, right? Can you have, how much agency do we have as players in the multiplayer game to alter the programming? So I'm going to bring this back to you, Jordan. Would you care to share what's in your pocket and maybe use that as a jumping off point for this part of the conversation?
Yeah, I've gone so deep down all this, to your points, okay, who's rendering it, how's it rendered, who's behind it, what's the purpose? Like I said, those three messages I got was, who are we, where are we, and why are we? And what I just, my, current, working conclusion is that this is I call it a simulator because our consciousness uses this the same way a pilot uses a flight simulator to become a better pilot. Our consciousness, which is non-physical by nature, enters into this physical reality to challenge itself through adversity, through restrictions, through all of these. When we're in this world, we come in with a memory wipe. We don't know why we're here. We don't know what our purpose is. We don't know what happened before, what happens next. We're alone. We're isolated. It's confusing. It's hard. There's struggle. But when you think about, say you go to the gym, a lot of times I call this consciousness CrossFit. We come here, and when you go to the gym, you only get stronger if you challenge yourself. The resistance is actually what makes you stronger. Those micro tears in your muscles rebuild, and they make you stronger. So you want to be challenged. You want adversity. And that's why I call it a simulator, because simulation kind of suggests that it's, like you said, it may be a replication of a different reality, or that it's done kind of like a programming software kind of a way, and we're NPCs, but I don't look at it that way. I'm not saying there's not possibly some backdrop characters like Dolores Cannon would say, but we are the main character in that we're here to grow and to learn. And that's why I call it a simulator, because usually simulators are meant for training purposes and growth purposes. Now, as far as what you're talking about, can we alter this reality? The information that comes in, I look at it almost like our body as a VR headset for our soul, for our consciousness. And each body is completely different, just like selecting a character in a video game. And you actually have this thing called the reticular activating system, bundle of neurons at the back of your brainstem, that the information comes in. Your five senses collect the information, bring it in, it passes through the reticular activating system into the thalamus, and it projects this mental projection into your cortex. And that cortex is kind of like the projection screen, like this. And based on your thoughts, your beliefs, your behaviors, your habits, your addictions, your fears, all that stuff, that's going to color, and that's going to bias that information. So your mental projection is very subjective. It's very personal to you, and everyone's is going to be different. But it's using objective data. So the world exists. I do believe there's a physical reality. I believe you're there, you're there, you're there. All the people in the crowd are here. That objective reality is very important, because if you lose track of that and you think everything's virtual, then you lose the responsibility aspect and you don't think any of this matters. And I think that being that this is a simulator for consciousness development, the responsibility part is a huge part of it. So we have to understand that I'm here, you're here, we all exist. There is an objective reality, but we're subjectively rendering it and experiencing it. And like John Archibald Wheeler would say, this is a participatory universe, and each of us is rendering it individually. And I think that's very important. Now, we can, affect our rendering. We do live in a simulation, but the simulation is between our ears, this inside of our head. And due to our fears and our emotions and our expectations, things like that, that flavors and alters our experience. And I think that's very important. This is not just some movie that we're passively watching. We are actively changing and editing and evolving the movie in real time. Now, you mentioned we just got back. I spent 4 days at a Hindu temple right before I came here, and we were learning things like spoon bending. We were learning how to, psychokinesis. It was a PK retreat. And we were literally learning how to affect physical matter reality with our thoughts in our mind. And you realize, like what I realized in spoon bending was that, my technique anyways, is that I'm temporarily, using intention, focused intention, I'm temporarily editing the code of reality. So we have these particles, like this spoon is made of metal alloys, and the particles in it, through millions of years of cause and effect, behave in very particular ways. And they have rule sets that govern them. And what I did is I gave it permission, temporary permission, to, kind of be flexible, to kind of release and relax those rigid rule sets so that I could use my mind and my focused intention to alter that physical matter. So it's like putting in a little snippet of code. It's like editing the code. But you do it in a way where because reality does not want to be too malleable, right? It wants to keep a predictable, rigidity. That's what makes the simulator so believable. So what you do is you basically give it permission to temporarily, relax those rule sets. And when you do that, you can change all sorts of things in physical matter.
To varying degrees. I mean, there's stories of, yogis who can levitate and, make things appear, or money comes pouring out of their mouths. Or there was, I recently came across I think it's the Gravachi numbers. I'm getting the name wrong, but this was a Russian theorist who conducted this experiment where he created this list of, I think it was like 15 7-digit sequences. And each one he assigned an intention to. And then he pulled together this large group of students and he said, I want you to repeat this 7-digit sequence over and over. He assigned 12 of you are taking this one and 12 of you, and you're going to associate this sequence with a specific intention. So the legend has it that the CIA was experimenting with this, and we can get into all that stuff in a minute too. So I read about this and I thought, I'm going to try it. Okay, so I'm going to try. So I picked one, unexpected money. That's a good one to pick, right? And my wife and I, we pulled the numbers out of a deck of cards and we just put them up on the wall in our den and memorized the numbers. And the theory is that enough people have imbued this sequence with this intent that by invoking the sequence, you're bringing the result of that intent into your life, even if you don't know what that intent is, okay? Now, I happen to know what it was. So we did this for a couple weeks, memorized it, kept running through, I've forgotten it now. And finally, I was like, nothing happened, this was stupid. I pulled the cards off the wall, I threw them in the trash. The next morning, there's mysteriously an $8,000 deposit in my checking account from an old contract that I'd completely forgotten about and had not been aware there was still a payment due on it. And I thought, well, that could be a coincidence, but it's an awfully startling one, yeah.
Okay, so first I want to address that, right? Because you remember what Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett has a certain theory to explain that, actually. So what she'll say is that she's a philosopher, and she would say that perhaps what reality does is it takes our intention, but it still tries to find the most efficient flow state, right, into reality. So in the same way that, the path of water finds the most efficient path to the ocean, in a similar way, like there's this great example of this one guy had seen this movie where this woman had this remarkable psychokinetic powers, right? She could change reality. And so one day he was sitting in front of this house waiting for someone, and he said, what would it be like if I had that kind of power? And as he's looking at the house, like a wall completely falls down, collapses, and dust bursts into the air. And he's like, am I doing this? Is this happening? Mm-hmm. And then he's still thinking about it. And then another wall collapses, right? And he thinks, wow, I have this amazing power. And then, a couple minutes later, lo and behold, up over the hill comes this bulldozer. Yeah. Right? And they're demolishing the house at that moment. Yeah. But the point is both can be true, right? There doesn't have to be one or the other. And perhaps that's how reality unfolds. And to this question too about how we can impact reality, another fascinating example is you'll have mediums who will be able to tune into some aspect of reality. And what they will find sometimes is that they'll see a Sanskrit letter sort of overlaid the scene they're seeing. And what that seems to point to is that ancient yogis, right, that were actually investigating the same things, associated certain figures with this, and because of that intention, that is now in the fabric of reality, in the field that someone today can actually
programmed
see.
in.
So we do see these things, and they don't have to necessarily stand out as these paranormal, supernatural, couldn't possibly be the case. I think sometimes it may be an efficient way that the rendering is kind of the most efficient combination of all of the conscious agents who are impacting the field.
Yeah, let me comment a little on that, because
Please.
you're touching on a few different issues. The first is, do we have free will or not in a simulated universe? And there's two versions of simulation theory. There's the NPC version, which stands for non-player character. So when Elon Musk gets on stage and says the chances that we're in base reality, meaning the chances that we're not in a simulation, is 1 in billions, what he's really talking about is the NPC version, which is just a computer, everybody is code, and that scares some people, particularly in the spiritual world. In the RPG version, the role-playing version, you are a character in a video game, and if you've ever played any video games, or when I was a kid, we used to play Dungeons and Dragons. And what do you do at the beginning? You choose your race of your character. You say, I'm going to be an elf, a dwarf, or a human, and then you choose the profession. I'm going to be a thief, a wizard, a cleric, a bard, and then you choose the particular campaign or quest that you're going to go on. And so what you've done is you've chosen a storyline. And now as a video game designer, we have these things called open world games, like Grand Theft Auto or something. You can go in and do anything. Now, you can't really do anything because the game designers have constricted it. And so when we have actually chosen our character and our storyline, like for example, I believe I have free will to make choices about whether I'm going to live in Boston or in San Francisco, right? But if I say I'm going to visualize that I'm going to be an NBA basketball player, okay, no matter how hard I try, that wasn't part of the storyline. So I'm not saying you can't do other things. It's those things are more difficult. And yet, being a computer programmer was really easy for me. It's almost like it was part of the story. In fact, if you had asked me in high school, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to be a software guy, an entrepreneur, and then a writer. Now, how did I know that? It was just this impression that I had. And then finally, I do believe we can influence reality in smaller ways very easily, and that it may just be a function of an information layer. So there's something called a technological synchronicity. So most of us have heard of the term synchronicity. You think of something, and then something in the physical world happens that's related to that, kind of like your money. But the other day, I was shopping for a backpack on my computer, a specific backpack. I put it in my shopping cart, and I thought I might buy it, but I decided not to. Then a few days later, on my phone, I see an ad in Facebook for that exact same backpack. Now, if I didn't know anything about the internet, in fact, if I denied that the internet exists, I would say either one, as a scientist, that's pure coincidence. There's no connection at all. Or as a spiritual person, I would say that's magic. It registers your thoughts. Now, I used to be in the online advertising industry, so I know exactly how that works. There's something called a cookie, and when you put the thing in your shopping cart, we literally say you have registered your intent in the database.
Wow.
And so then the advertising engine creates that ad on the fly. And so if we think of the world as having a set of databases and an information layer, we are registering our intent like you were doing.
Yeah.
And then the engine of karma that's creating these situations for us in our daily lives ends up finding the one that's appropriate at that point in time and presents it to us. And we think, wow, how did that happen? So it's a good way to think about these mysterious processes.
Yeah. That was a very muscular description. I appreciate it. So this then, I think what we've done here is we've walked into perhaps, I don't want to say normalizing, but making plausible things that we're taught are far outside the realm of plausibility, like magic. Right? And so what we've all just described here is what people would call magic, right? And in fact, the basis of ritual magic is the basis of the numeric system that I just described. I once was at a dinner party with some witches, women who practice the Wiccan religion, and I said, listen, I've always wondered, does the ritual of ritual magic have any inherent power, or is it just sort of a way of focusing your intention and that's where the result comes from? And the answer was really interesting. It's both. And what she explained to me was that their belief system is that, very similar to the Gravachi numbers, that ritual has been performed so many times and imbued with a specific intention that the ritual itself begins to sort of like grok, and that intention becomes sticky to it. And so without anyone imbuing it with intention, it would never have any power, but it starts to have a life of its own at a certain point. And so this is, I'm drawing a connection between technology and magic. And I also want to make a point I think is very important, and it speaks to the arrogance of humanity, that when we don't understand something, or let me put this more specifically, when we don't possess the means to measure something, we call it supernatural. The second we can measure it, we say it's part of the natural world. And I think my favorite example of this is barometric pressure. That there was a time when Aunt Agnes's knee hurt, it meant it was going to rain, and that was magic. And then lo and behold, it turns out there's a thing called barometric pressure, and there's a meter, right? It's called a barometer. It's a barometer. And now we understand, oh, that wasn't magic. It was science. Magic is simply things that our science doesn't understand. And so, quantum physics has been invoked a few times today. And so to sort of, I guess, tie things up, I would make the supposition that just as, I forget who was the politician who said democracy is a failed system, but it's the best one we've got. Who was it who said that? I don't remember.
Don't remember.
Okay. Well, physics it works, but it only goes so far, right? It's like it only allows us to kind of see a few inches in front of our nose. Jordan, did you have something to say about it?
Well, I mean, I would explain that, like I used the metaphor earlier, that we are a combination of a higher self and a human self. So if you want to break it down to the video game world, imagine those old school games. You're playing that like kind of stand-up cabinet game, and you're the guy in the game, right? But you're also the person playing the game. So imagine the higher self being the one outside the cabinet playing the game, the human self being the character inside the game. Now that character in the game has to abide by all the rule sets and the physics, the game engines and everything that is governing that game world. So it's very restrictive. And it can only see certain things. But imagine that character is going, and first of all, you said magic. Okay, imagine the building in the distance starts rendering in real time. It gets more clear and more clear. Imagine he opens the door to the building, and all of a sudden everything like renders. Well, that would seem like magic to his limited perception inside the game. But then zoom out, and now we're the higher self outside the game. We know exactly what's happening. We know he's about to open that door and that building's interior is about to render. So to us, with a broader perspective, that wouldn't be magic at all. We would understand and we would expect that to happen. So a lot of it's perspective. When you're inside the game, you have to have that limited point of view because that's what keeps the experience so immersive. That's how you learn. That's how it can, if you knew all those things, then you wouldn't take it as seriously. You have to be fully immersed. Just like when a pilot uses a flight simulator to train, after a certain amount of time, and you talked about this, Riz, when you were playing that ping pong game, you're like, how long would I have to play this game for me to forget there was a world outside of this? Well, when pilots are in those flight simulators, they voluntarily go into the flight simulator the same way I think our consciousness voluntarily comes into this physical world. But after a certain amount of time, you forget that you are an intelligence and a consciousness outside of this. You forget you had previous human lifetimes. You forget you had previous lifetimes as different life forms and different energy systems. You forget about all that. You're fully immersed. And that's all part of the immersive experience. So what you're talking about magic, like the magic can be literally explained by just perspective. Like technology, when we deal with these non-human intelligence and what we call aliens and different, humanoid beings that seem to have this magical abilities and technology and craft. Well, if we went back 500 years and showed them an iPhone, they would think that we were sorcerers or wizards or aliens or something like that. There's even the cargo cult theory where we could land right now on a island somewhere in the Pacific to a indigenous tribe. We would seem like gods or demons or magicians. So a lot of it's just perspective.
Sure. Well, that's something, bringing it back to my world, which is I come from the world of film. I often think of look at this through the analogy of storytelling, which is a whole other panel. But I've come to this conclusion that we are both the author and the protagonist of our own story. This is exactly what you're saying. In our last couple of minutes, I want to talk about technology, which is something that's come up a lot, and I want to just make the point that we think of technology as something that is synthetic, But to use your cell phone example, Jordan, a cell phone is a piece of tech that is designed to take the burden of a certain kind of drudgery of thought off of our brains to free us up to do other things. It thinks for us. I can't remember 1,500 phone numbers. I don't have to. My phone does it, right? My phone. So what are we but a cell phone, right? And are we someone's cell phone? What is the difference between a cell phone and a human being? Ultimately, our brain is a computation device, right? So just to wrap things up and to kind of pull all this together, for anyone who is taking an interest in what we're talking about, what advice does each of you have to for someone that wants to sort of dabble in this space a little bit and maybe see if they can affect some change that would demonstrably prove to them that the things we're talking about are real?
I'll jump in first. I think there's an amazing capacity that arises just with the idea of possibility, right? So in other words, when we've been raised in a curriculum and in a worldview that says there's a naturalistic world out there that happens regardless of what you think about it, you have no impact on it, then you're not even going to try, right? You just have been assumed that this is the case. It's been bludgeoned into you. And yet, we think about the collapse of the wave function, the way that quantum physics understands the observer/participator in the nature of reality itself. I mean, many scientists, many physicists are deeply uncomfortable with this and have been spending more than 100 years trying to find their way out of it. To deny it, right? And yet it inevitably seems to be the case. And it was Arthur C. Clarke, to your earlier point, who said any sufficiently advanced technology will be indistinguishable from magic. Right? From the people who understand it. Now, what I would suggest is that we, to your point, often think about technology as kind of an external technology, right? Although we do have software. Well, if ultimately consciousness renders everything, in other words, intention, right? Dreamscapes, if these are all dreamscapes, then the ultimate technology will be at the level of rendering consciousness, rendering the construct, right? And when we think about, we've mentioned a couple times, non-human intelligences and their advanced nature, it may be that it's not just that they have external tech that can make a wall disappear so they can walk in, but they may be working at the level of the fabric of reality. Like prior to the rendering, like again, from a software engineering point of view, that would be easy to do. That would be code injection at that point. So because I would argue that we are all instantiations, downstream instantiations of that same pure awareness, we are it, right? Then we have that capacity, and a huge part of what comes online is just when you believe it's possible.
Wonderful, thank you.
Well, I know we don't have much time left, so quickly I'll say you can do it experientially or you can look at it intellectually. And experientially, basically, you can look for glitches in the matrix, right? Which is synchronicities, precognitive dreams. Some people see actual objects. There's something called the Mandela effect. We don't probably have a lot of time to get into it, but I wrote a second simulation book called The Simulated Multiverse, which was about this idea that people remembering the past differently could actually be a sign that the simulation has been run more than once. And Philip K. Dick talked about this a lot, and if you've seen the show The Man in the High Castle. So I would say experientially is probably one way to convince yourself. The second way is intellectually. Look into information, digital physics as the basis of the universe. And of course, the ideas of quantum physics, I think, tie into that. Even the multiverse theory, which people know from superhero movies, like, the three Spider-Men kind of all pointing at each other.
Well, I'll say a game that I play with some friends is if we're going away for the weekend together, each of us chooses an image and we focus on that image and we see how often that image shows up throughout the weekend. And it has to be deliberately something very obscure. It works every time. Jordan?
I would say, so we have two different hemispheres of our brain. The left part is our logical part, and it keeps us kind of locked into this physical matter reality. A great way is to kind of get more in tune with your right side, the more intuitive side, and that will allow you to not be so analytical and allow you to experience things that you would normally filter out. I use Monroe Institute was a big part of my journey, and using like binaural beats, it gives you this like surrogate left brain. It kind of helps you put your left brain to sleep for just a little bit, move it out of the way so that you can transition in that more intuitive side. It helps you get to these altered states of consciousness where you can dial in and experience some of these more mystical, magical elements of reality before you reinstitute your left brain to kind of take over and have a more lucid experience. And I think that way, especially for people like me that's more analytical and logical minded, it helps to have practices like meditation and breath work and things like that allow you to get out of that logical processing mindset and get more into your connected, holistic mindset.
Yeah, and that's a great example. Monroe actually has protocols. You can read them, understand them, and do them. It's not abstract. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have, and I think this is also just a good way to sort of set up our next panel, which is in an hour, which is Molly Adler from Back from the Borderline and Michael Phillip from Third Eye Drops, who will talk about what happens when you deliberately infuse spirituality into tech. So that'll be our next talk, and thanks for coming out, folks, and thank you guys for being here.
Thanks, guys.